All right, good morning, everyone. If you could please take your seats. Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Todd Harrison. I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of the Aerospace Security Project and Director of Defense Budget Analysis here at CSIS. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We've got a great lineup of speakers. First, I want to take a moment to thank our partner in putting on this event and helping us get the lineup together, the newly created National Security Space Association, and Steve Jakes is the acting executive director of that organization. I want to thank them for helping us put this together today. I also want to thank our sponsors who contributed to this event: General Dynamics Mission Systems, Harris Corporation, LinkWest Corporation, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems, SES Government Solutions, and Vox Space. A few administrative notes before we get started. First of all, when we're doing Q&A today, we're going to use an online question system, even for those of you in the room, but also for people who are watching online at home. If you want to submit a question, go to this website that you see here. You can enter your question in that form. If you want, you can include your name. You don't have to. And that's going to go, and it's going to go up here on a tablet that I'm looking at in the front of the room, so we don't have to run around with microphones throughout the day. And so what I'll look for, of course, are if I see a lot of questions on the same subject, I'll try to make sure that we get to that. The other administrative note is, if any of you have ever been involved in putting on a conference like this, the moment you tell the printers they can go ahead and print the agenda, that's when it's going to change. And so, of course, that happened. So we have an insert here within the program. So, please note the change in lineup. We did remove a coffee break, so I'll apologize for that in advance. But you still get 2 coffee breaks, so it should be okay. All right, so I want to kick off the event today with our first speaker. That is Dr. Will Roper. Dr. Will Roper is the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. In this position, he is the Air Force's Senior Acquisition Executive. He oversees research and development, test, production, and modernization efforts within the Air Force. And prior to this current position, you may remember Dr. Roper was the founding director of the Pentagon's Strategic Capabilities Office, and he served in that role, I think, from 2012 to 2018. He previously served as the acting chief architect of the Missile Defense Agency. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roper to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Todd, for the introduction. Thank you, CSIS, for hosting these events. It's an important time to be talking about space. Throughout recorded history, and likely even before then, humanity has been inextricably linked to information from space. The waxing and waning of sun paths and moon phases provided critical information about seasons and time, and the stars a way to navigate over great and treacherous distances. What was once a seasonal, monthly, perhaps daily connection is now nearly continuous. Satellites furnish time to within nanoseconds and position to within meters, as well as 24/7 communications and imagery, weather, entertainment, and much more. Many of us likely got here today because our lives are connected to space. The world space economy is currently valued at approximately $385 billion. At least 666 intelligence satellites from 38 countries monitor the globe. 790 communication satellites from 45 countries move critical data. 121 navigation satellites help us navigate from point A's to point B's. And 303 scientific satellites push the frontiers of learning in all manners of science. Of these, the United States accounts for 353, 391, 31, and 94 respectively. A 46% Eagles share, if you do the math. Having experienced nearly 7% annual growth for a decade, top investment firms predict over $1 trillion industry by 2040, with some firms going even as high as $3 trillion. With space-based broadband, cheaper reusable rockets, and space tourism nearly here, and energy, mining, and transportation looking increasingly possible, our national interest and treasure are increasingly migrating to space, and correspondingly, our national security concerns. Countries like China have already demonstrated their intention to escalate hostilities into space, first conducting a debris-forming anti-satellite test in 2007. China has conducted training with ASAT weapons that will be fully operational within a few years. Having opened this Pandora's box, cyber, jamming, lasers, high-power microwave, and space-based weapons cannot be ruled out as future threats, especially when the laws of physics make critical asset locations uncomfortably predictable. With so much riding on industrializing space, it is naive to assume that conflict will not reach escape velocity. Why fight a nation's stealth fighters, aircraft carriers, or brigade combat teams if you can defeat the satellites that guide their maneuver, communication, or weapons? Why fight their military at all if their critical economic veins flow through space? We can look the other way from our terrestrial comfort zone no longer. Wars will extend into space until a new theory of deterrence supplants apparent advantages hostilities in space would provide. Consequently, the Air Force is developing options and the training, manning, and equipping to use them so that space is never our nation's Achilles heel, rather our strong shield protecting a new industrial revolution and all its exciting possibilities. This is the hope emerging from Pandora's box. The Air Force has maintained the world's most cutting-edge lethal force for over 70 years with systems known and unknown. We have been pioneers in uncontested space, providing GPS to the world, monitoring space debris to keep commercial satellites safe, detecting ballistic missiles to protect our friends, allies, and the American people. Now that our gloves have been forced off, we are combining our warfighting and space know-how to contend with the contested space we know we will face. Our FY20 space budget request is $14 billion, a 17% increase from last year's, to develop new defendable space capabilities. But it isn't just larger, it's faster and smarter too, incorporating speedy acquisition authorities, fast contracting approaches, and strategic industry partnerships. Speed is not an Air Force tagline, it is a whetstone for keeping our cutting edge. While we join the discussion about how best to organize, our eyes are on the threat, our ears on our warfighters' needs, and our foot on the accelerator. Let me share some highlights with you in 3 areas: our space warfighters, fast acquisitions, and expanding our industrial partnerships. On space warfighters, everything we do is about the warfighters, those current and those in future. Our space budget is helping build multi-domain airmen to fight as part of a joint force. Just like cyber, no scenario of conflict decouples from space. So our warfighters must be fluent with every service, every adversary, and every contingency. This budget funds advanced force development, adding 19 weeks of space warfighter courses, a U.S. Space Command to plan and conduct operations, and initial long lead efforts for a U.S. Space Force. From our Chief of Staff to our warfighters on the ops floor, multi-domain operations are driving new requirements and closer relationships between warfighters and acquisition. This budget's primary example is our Advanced Battle Management System, envisioned as a family of system replacement for the aging J-STARS aircraft. This capability will cut across all domains of the Air Force, air, space, and cyberspace, pushing the envelope to paper-burning speeds as we trailblaze how to design, build, and field multi-domain capabilities in the future. With so many new challenges driving unprecedented approaches to space-based capabilities, it is no wonder that a faster, smarter acquisition system is a top 3 priority for our service secretary. Now on faster acquisitions, Restoring a competitive mindset to how we design, manufacture, and sustain war-winning capabilities has taken deep root in our new space systems. New authorities, delegation, and close partnerships with our warfighters have revved our acquisition engine, removing 78 and a half years of unnecessary schedule on our century quest to reach 100, and 21 and a half of this currently comes from space, with more to come. Stealing back time from our adversaries and giving it to our space warfighters is a paradigm shift that must become the norm, and thankfully, we have talented space operators and acquisition professionals that have been itching for this change. And this past year, we empowered them to effect it. First, we reorganized the Space and Missile Center, adding 3 new program executive officers, our highest acquisition positions, with delegated authority to speed decision velocity. They aggressively applied Section 804 authorities and tailored 5,000 approaches to our new satellite programs. Next-Gen Missile Warning is currently on track to deliver 3.5 years ahead of schedule, given planned reprogramming this year. Protected Tactical Enterprise Service is fielding on aircraft carrier strike groups 1.5 years ahead of schedule. And our strategic, tactical, and polar SATCOM programs combined for 8 years of acceleration. And the latter received the Department's top acquisition award for proposing a U.S. payload on a Norwegian satellite, saving time and money. Not just fast, smart too. Second, we stood up our second software factory in an Air Force-wide pivot to agile software development. Like our Boston-based Kessel Run, named from Star Wars, Los Angeles now has Kobayashi Maru, named after Star Trek's impossible training scenario that Kirk hacked to win. Inspired by this, Kobayashi Maru is hacking space command and control with developers and operators working side by side, pushing code to warfighters in months, not years. Having already delivered their first increment of code to Air Force Space Command, we're excited to see more space programs shift to agile development. We're also glad that our naming convention is balanced between the Star Wars and Star Trek universes. Hopefully, the gods of nerddom will smile on our new software motto, "May our force live long and prosper." Third, we are focused on contracting reform. Prototype contracting at the Space and Missile Center is down to 90 days, twice as fast as historical norms. And contingency contracting to provide overhead support to California's battle against deadly wildfires was completed in 8 hours. These steps are part of a much broader effort to bring down time for contracting. We must have purchasing speed when our nation needs it. Fourth, to accelerate classified capabilities, we stood up our Space Rapid Capabilities Office and initiated 3 classified programs that continue in the budget. Partnered after the awesome office that manages our X-37 spaceplane, this new program executive office brings our space total to 5. That's up from only 1 last year, 5 program executive officers in space. This increases our decision speed while developing the new capabilities our future warfighters desperately need. Fifth, we have expanded external partnerships with organizations like DARPA and my former office, the Strategic Capabilities Office, on concepts like disaggregated low Earth orbit constellations and new classified systems. Lowering risk on high payoff technologies helps us leapfrog the transition valley of death and hopefully future threats too. Our door is always open for new partnerships where we see the potential for speed, lower cost, and delivering for the warfighter. On expanding industrial partnerships, as we accelerate programs, we're also looking ahead to the long-term health of our partnerships with both traditional defense companies and commercial ones too. We cannot compete over time, cannot build the joint force that we need without a sustainable strategy for both types of company. We hope that groups like CSIS and other organizational brainpower assembled here will help us get this complex task right. But we are not waiting around to move out on steps we think will help. One step is increasing competitive prototyping. Space programs like Next-Gen Missile Warning, Enhanced Strategic SATCOM, and Protected Tactical SATCOM are using prototyping so that new market entrants can compete against incumbents, induce better prices, and leave behind a stronger industry base for future programs. This strategic thinking needs to be everywhere and all the time in acquisition. Until opportunities to design, build, and launch new satellites occur more frequently and routinely, we must plant industrial seeds in our programs to bear future fruit. Another step is pursuing collaborative development partnerships when defense and commercial interests align. Launch service is a fantastic example of defense spending spurring a new commercial launch industry base that can also meet our national security requirements. We are also beginning collaboration with industry on how truly operationally responsive space launch might work. These examples are encouraging, but they need to be more commonplace. With so many services appearing to move to space, the trend of dual-use capability partnerships should continue to expand, and I expect it to. A third step is significantly accelerating how we do business with space startups and commercial tech providers. Currently, awarding a contract in months is a flash for the government, but for startups living hand to mouth, it's an eternity. As a result, we are not competing for the best space ideas in the accelerating tech ecosystem. Orbiting our challenges to reach escape velocity should be easy, should be rewarding, and hopefully a bit cool. Instead, startups face an amusement park sign when they look at the government. You must be this tall to ride the ride. And I'm glad to say we are finally taking steps to take it down. 2 weeks ago, we held our first Air Force Pitch Day in New York. We invited small businesses from across the country to pitch their ideas, and our team of venture ninjas had 51 of them on one-page contracts worth $8.75 million and paid in less than 15 minutes. The fastest was in 3. This is a paradigm shift, folks. This took place during a fantastic week where we awarded 242 small business awards, many of which were space-related. We saw companies building satellites to provide downlink hotspots in space. Others were applying AI to speed the ability to find objects in space-based imagery. Others were turning that imagery into 3D maps with all sorts of applications. Cool ideas that ought to be connected to our Air Force, and now they are. We can ill afford the next generation of space and tech companies to grow and be disconnected from our mission. We must be able to work with the entire industry base to compete and win over time. With $660 million each year in our small business innovation account, we are an ideal space investment partner. Our money is non-dilutive. Our company equity ownership requirements, 0. Our return on investment expectations, conservative. Our resources, significant. Our payment speed, now lightning. And our mission and people, nothing less than inspiring. With the Pitch Day authority now delegated to the field, including our space shops, the next events are already in planning, including an Air Force Pitch Bowl, a big event, a chance for a company to get a truly game-changing investment for a game-changing idea as the likely culminating event in our outreach to small businesses and commercial industry. We expect big things from our small business dollars in future. What about worries? Despite our optimism, there are things keeping us up at night. Return of continuing resolutions, budget control act caps, and delayed reprogrammings, to name a few. I know they're common to say, but here past the talking point. We can't go fast without funding. We can't predict what we'll be doing next year and next year to compete and win in our programs without stability of dollars. Going fast without predictable funding is like a road trip without predictable fuel. Forces worst-case contingency planning and necessarily suboptimal behavior. Programs like our family of SATCOMs need predictable funding if they're going to build up competition. And next-generation missile warning needs planned reprogramming to continue what they've already started. Aside from delivering on time for General Hyten, commander of U.S. STRATCOM, the top priority, these efforts expand our industry base, so we are anxious to keep them fully funded. Well, to conclude, this budget request is a first step towards dealing with the future challenges we face. With Pandora's box now open in space, the Air Force has moved out on designing defendable space, accelerating how we buy it, and training to use it in future multi-domain conflicts. With so many space technologies currently on the cusp of maturity, the future is a deck of wild cards where hands are difficult to predict. So to compete and win, we have to be fast, we have to be adaptable, we have to work with the entire industry base, and we have to have a few aces up our sleeves. With this budget, we're making a good start, but we must follow it with many more. Like our forebears, we are all connected to space, but unlike them, we must defend it to keep its future bright. May God bless us and our airmen and their families in this endeavor. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you for those great remarks, Dr. Roper. Next, I want to welcome to the stage Representative Jim Cooper. He represents Tennessee's 5th Congressional District. He served in that seat since, I think, 2003. He is the chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, which, of course, oversees United States strategic weapons, ballistic missile defense, space programs, and Department of Energy national security programs. Representative Cooper also serves on the Committee on Oversight and Reform, as well as the Budget Committee. Please join me in welcoming Representative Cooper. Thank you for joining us. So, a lot of interesting things going on in space right now. I want to give you an opportunity to share some of your initial thoughts before we go into Q&A. And I'll remind everyone, if you want to submit a question, go to the website. You can enter that, and we'll be watching.
Well, thank you, Todd. I'm delighted to be back. I make a practice of trying to be bipartisan, so I'm sorry none of my Republican colleagues were able to join. But I very much appreciated the prior chairman, Mike Rogers, including me in everything and keeping things on a nonpartisan or bipartisan basis. I was inspired by Bill Roper's talk. I thought that was a new energy and vision for the Air Force. Some of the developments, like who wouldn't want to be funded in 3 minutes? Like, that's pretty powerful. I have some kids who wouldn't mind that. But this is such an important topic, and you and CSIS have been a real leader in helping the nation focus on this. Sadly, we've neglected some of this for some time, and I appreciated Bill's positivity, but a lot of these issues have been lurking for 10, 20 years, and now we're finally paying attention. I'm proud of the House's role in this because 2 years ago, Mike Rogers and I proposed a Space Corps to try to refocus the Air Force on some of these important issues. That met with a mixed reception from the Air Force and from some of our friends on the Senate side. But then, of course, when President Trump weighed in with his Space Force proposal, which I thought was over the top, that did help break some ice both within the Air Force and possibly even in the U.S. Senate to create a more open-minded approach on emphasizing our space needs. So I think we're in a magic moment right now for our country when we're refocusing on what's really important. I'm thankful that it's not a Sputnik moment where we haven't already visibly proven that we're terribly behind. But invisibly, we are probably behind. And I try to stress the positive as well as the negative. The world should be so thankful that we've given it things like GPS, where anybody for free on the planet can find out exactly where they are. Precision navigation and position navigation and timing are essential services for virtually everything, as Bill alluded to in his remarks. And also things like space traffic control. That's an extraordinarily helpful service when there's so much junk in space, and even a tiny particle can take out a satellite. So that air traffic control function is sometimes overlooked, but it's invaluable for these sometimes billion-dollar assets that are above our heads. And I think the world should be grateful for that because the United States has been a very benevolent power in supplying these services. And the goal is to keep them safe for everybody on the planet and to keep every nation's satellites safe. So I see this as a very positive focus. We need to protect our own, but we really need to protect everybody's because it's a global commons, and we need to treat it that way so that it's good for the planet. So I appreciate, as I say, your leadership role in this. I hope Congress can get out of the way of the good developments in the Air Force and in the services. A lot of good things are happening, and I'm excited about that new opportunity for us.
And you mentioned you and Representative Rogers 2 years ago put forth a proposal to create a new military services Space Corps that would be under the Department of the Air Force. Can you give us just a little bit of the background on what got you and Representative Rogers so interested in this issue that brought you to that moment 2 years ago? Because you were out on the leading edge of this before it was cool. What made you push out on this particular issue?
Well, I'd like to say that we were just Star Trek or Star Wars fans, but that's probably not as true as it should be. Mike had 3 terms as chairman, and our first term, unfortunately, was spent on DOE security because some of our plants were not well guarded. His second term was spent on trying to make sure that our nuclear facilities were upgraded because sadly many of them had fallen almost apart from the 40s and 50s when they were initially built. Space was the next priority. It's obvious if you attend any of the briefings that we're a little bit behind. And it's not just the 2007 Chinese ASAT test, which sadly, really for the whole planet, created, 14,000 pieces of junk in space. And when they're traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, that's a true hazard. And no one really knows how to clean that up yet. So why are we polluting some of the essential orbits in space? This shouldn't happen by any nation. But it's really more of the malign intent that you can see in some of our near-peer rivals. Why are they spending precious money when their nations are poor to do this? That should create doubt and suspicion. Now, we don't want to assume the worst, but they're expending these precious assets to do these things that really help none of their citizens. So I think ideally we would have taken space on earlier. We tried to give the Air Force the benefit of the doubt. We looked at their promotion rolls and saw year after year it was mainly the fighter jocks who got to be general. And I love leather jackets and fighter pilots, but that's not the future. Unmanned aircraft, as we've seen with drones, are increasingly important in the world. So we've got to pay attention to technology and be up to speed and not have the nation be in any way behind. In fact, we need a huge and safe margin.
And so you said that Trump's initial Space Force proposal was over the top. What are your views on the legislative proposal that was just submitted to Congress a few weeks ago?
I think it's way more modest. In fact, it's about as close to our original House proposal as you can get. I think it uses some Pentagon terminology that we're comfortable with: a space command, a space development agency, apparently much like the Missile Development Agency. But what really matters is not the bureaucracy, but the substance. We need to be able to acquire state-of-the-art technology and put it on orbit in record time. And I don't mean Air Force record time. I mean faster than the NRO. I mean faster than, because what matters is threat-based environment. What matters is meeting the nation's needs, and any obstacle that stands in the way has to be taken out, especially if it's our own bureaucracy at work. I was interested in Bill's comments. What does he worry about at night? Well, I'm worried about Congress too. I'm more worried than he is. And CRs are terrible, budget caps are terrible, and we need to clean up our own house. But we also need to make sure that the vast bureaucracy that is the Pentagon can function efficiently. And in general, less hierarchical organization, leaner organizations, better talent recruitment, better talent retention. Those things are essential for any vibrant, cutting-edge organization. And I think we can, as the Air Force is showing signs of doing, move more in that direction.
So we got a couple of questions from the audience here that are related, so I'll ask them together. HASC Chairman Adam Smith of the Armed Services Committee has said that what they intend to do in the Armed Services Committee is write a Space Force proposal that is different than DOD's. And of course, you have your proposal from 2 years ago. How do you think you can merge those ideas, or what changes would you want to make to what the administration proposed?
Well, my guess is, from the administration standpoint, they mainly care that we call it a Space Force, whatever we're doing. Okay, we do that. The House proposal, if you didn't keep up with the committee vote, was passed out of committee 60-1. 60-1. That very rarely happens. Now, we didn't succeed as we would have liked in conference, but the seeds were planted. And most everybody I talked to who's been to the briefings are like totally on board. Now you can quibble about this element of bureaucracy or that, but the key principles I think are there. We've got to have an unrivaled space capability, and I think we're on track to make that happen.
And so I'm getting a question from many people here in the audience. If you had to put odds on it, what do you think the odds are of some sort of a Space Force initiative getting through the House this year on the NDAA and also getting through the Senate?
The trouble about the future is it's hard to predict, but in this one, after the 60-1 vote a couple of years ago, overwhelming floor passage, I think the prospects could hardly be brighter. Now, the future is unforeseeable. There could be some glitch to come up, but I think we're on a path here to achieve everyone's goals, which is first, greater capability for our country.
All right. Now, Dr. Roper talked about the Air Force's emphasis on speed in acquisitions. And we've heard that a lot from other senior leaders within the department as well. This is a big shift from about a decade ago when you had, Secretary Bob Gates talking about how, we need to do things cheaper. We don't need the 99% exquisite solution when the 80% solution will work. How do you view that shift in emphasis on acquisitions to prioritize speed, which may come at the expense of cost?
Well, for the historians in the audience, I think every year people have tried to reform Pentagon acquisitions all the way back to the Eisenhower administration. And I'm not sure that anyone has succeeded. If you noticed in Bill's remarks, he made a glancing reference to the accelerated 5,000 procedures. Like, good luck with that one. SOCOM and others, MDA, have used faster authorities, different authorities, to try to get around the 5,000 procedures. So you kind of ask yourself, why do we still have the 5,000 procedures? But there is so much inertia. This is one of the most difficult bureaucratic problems on the planet. And there are a lot of equities that different interests have and different elements of the status quo. But that should never stop us from fielding promptly superior capability. I was interested because in the Pentagon proposal by 2024, we will have a fully fielded Space Force. So in the time it took us to start and win World War II, or to respond to Pearl Harbor and win World War II, we will finally be able to field one service. That's faster than usual, but it's still not what we should be expecting. So I look forward to working with everybody in Congress in both parties and with the Pentagon and with our industrial community to try to figure out a way to return to speed and quality, because nobody wants speed for speed's sake. You also want affordable prices. So there are ways to do this. This is the most ingenious country that's ever been. Let's tap into that ingenuity in a more constructive way.
So another question from the audience here. One of the things that Chairman Smith has said publicly in recent days is that within the Space Force proposal, I think there are 3 4-star positions enumerated in that, and he thinks that that's too many and it won't reduce bureaucracy. What's your view, and how can you remedy that?
Well, Adam Smith is a great chairman. He's extremely knowledgeable, and I think he's very fair on these issues. And it's no secret that the military has been top-heavy for some time in virtually every department. Bureaucracies tend to do that. Who doesn't want a higher rank and to be paid more money and to have a better retirement? Like, what's wrong with that? But right now, and if you make any comparison to a prior point in history, we're vastly top-heavy. So there have got to be ways to do that and be fair to people. Now, you need to give young people promotion opportunities. But in this vast pyramid, there got to be better ways to do that. And to me, the number of excessive generals is interesting. It's also important how long you're on post at whatever your MOS is. And do you really know your job? And I tend to prefer the Navy model where you're on duty for 6 or 8 years in naval reactors and you really know what you're talking about and you have total responsibility, as opposed to the in and out 2 or 3 year thing when you parachute in. You really don't know the assignment. By the time you're an expert, you're out of there. Like, how does that work? And I want varied assignments. I want a humane treatment of our personnel, but there's nothing like real expertise. Owning the project, seeing it through to the end, making sure it's first rate. And I don't want to dwell on some of the negative things, but there have been some horrendous problems. And while some in the Air Force are proud that still the B-52 will be flying when it's 100 years old, I worry about that, no matter how thoroughly it's been rebuilt. And I appreciate the rebuilding efforts that have been going on, but like, where are the new, where are the superb, where are the excellent, and we've kind of been lacking in that for a few years.
Next question here from the audience is about the cost of the Space Force. And so the Pentagon proposal pegs that cost over 5 years at about $2 billion, and then the steady state cost of the additional management and overhead would be about $500 million a year after that. Since you obviously are in support of some sort of a Space Corps, Space Force, a new service, but many of your colleagues have questioned the cost, including Chairman Smith, among others. What do you think the right level of overhead is that would be sufficient for the new service, but also would not be so much that it would cause it to lose support from your colleagues?
Well, first, think what a vast improvement the $2 billion number is over the $13 billion number that the Secretary of the Air Force had put out there. Now, both Mike Rogers and I thought that was a little bit of a gold-plated proposal, but we're already headed in the right direction. When Mike and I originally proposed this, we really thought there should be very little, if any, additional cost, because the Air Force is pretty well resourced already. It's more of an organizational issue when you have 60 people who are empowered to say no, but no one has the ability to say yes. That's an issue, but that's the way bureaucracy tends to work. So we will be getting into the numbers. We just are getting the budget books right now from the Pentagon. The budget is late, as you know, and I'm not going to fault anybody over that, but we will do our best in the NDAA to have the 58th or 59th consecutive year of House and Senate passage of that bill. If there's any element of Congress that still works, it's probably the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. And remember, when you're talking about budgeting in this space, I always say this is the only part of the federal budget that we don't get to set. It's entirely threat-based. We have to be able to respond to meet and beat whatever is coming at us. So we will do what it takes. We must do what it takes. And the numbers you're mentioning in a budget that's $750 billion or so, even though shamefully 165 of that is OCO, like, whoa. This is chicken feed for what Bill Roper accurately described as an absolutely vital national capability. Not just talking about the warfighter, but for all of our civilization. I know some people who can't play golf without satellites because they need to know the distance to the green. So this is a very important thing, and we're well within the ballpark of reasonable compromise here.
And speaking of the budget, you mentioned the OCO part of the request. What's your view of the overall budget request for FY20? So, not just space, but the overall budget, and how do you think the House is going to handle all of the OCO for base activities that the administration has tucked in there in this request?
Well, for anyone who hates acronyms like I do, OCO, or Overseas Contingency Operations, was used as an emergency funding measure after the Iraq and Afghan wars started. And on a temporary basis, that's very understandable. But 15, 18 years later, especially when base activities are included in that emergency funding, it really becomes inexcusable. This is a harsh way to put it, but to have an off-budget element of your budget really means that you're not telling the truth. And some of our near-peer adversaries out there are more tuned into our budget than we are, and perhaps our Chinese friends are paying attention that we are not really fully funding our soldiers posted abroad. We're paying most of the bills, but they're having to pick up the tab when they buy our bonds for some of these needs. And by the way, one of the most distressing things is we're probably funding the entire Chinese defense budget because they have bought so many of our bonds, $1 trillion plus, that just the interest on those bonds can't pay for their entire defense budget. Wow. That is not, now we appreciate their investment in our debt, but this is not a good situation, but it shows overall how many of our fiscal policies have been woefully mismanaged, and we're going to have to return to common sense in some of these things. And right now, neither party wants to talk about fiscal sanity.
And so another question from the audience here, it's specific to North Korea, but we can broaden it a bit more than that. When we talk about ballistic missile threats that the country is facing and need to improve missile defense systems, theater, and homeland, what do you think the role of our space forces should be in that? Does a reorganization, first of all, does that help? And what are the types of new capabilities that we can or should be fielding so that we can better support that missile defense mission?
Well, when space is properly run, it's almost completely invisible and taken for granted. It's our infrastructure of infrastructures on which all of our networks really depend. So it's a little bit like the plumber or electrician. You only need them when you're really hurting. And I hope our allies never have to focus on this capability. I hope that what is needed will be available on a timely basis. And that's a well-working system. Invisible above our heads, maybe you can see them twinkle at night, but other than that, you're completely unaware when you're depending on their services. So I think our allies should be very confident that, what did Bill say, that we have 46% market share of satellites in space already. And it's not just the number of satellites, it's the capabilities they're on. And I think the number would be vastly higher if you looked at capabilities. But anybody who keeps up with this area should know that who you're going to call when you need something in space. It's basically us. But we got to keep it that way and not let our margins shrink.
And what are your views on the talk about creating a space sensor layer for missile defense, in part to be able to detect and track hypersonic missiles, but also to do better target discrimination in the mid-course phase of flight? Is that a system you would support, a space sensor layer? And if so, do you think that should be under the Space Development Agency, as they're talking about now, or should that be under SMC, the Space and Missile Systems Center within the Air Force?
Well, in the first part of your question, who's against sensors? Don't we need to know what's going on? Especially since the U.S. has been exclusively in space a benevolent power. We need to know, the world needs to know what's going on. I mentioned space junk already. That's just the most obvious way. Some people call it a space fence. That's a way to protect the world's assets and the world itself. If something's going on the planet, it's helpful to know. Every once in a while, a meteor hits the Earth. The Chelyabinsk meteor, an airburst with the power of large nuclear weapon over a city in Russia of 1 million people. And that was apparently a surprise to most people. I'm glad it didn't provoke a nuclear response or any sort of response. But things like that happen. So being in touch with your own planet is generally a good thing. So I really don't know anyone who's against sensors. Otherwise, do we want to be deaf, dumb, and blind? I don't think so. It's good to be in tune with what's going on.
And so where do you think responsibility for a program like that should fall, ideally?
Well, the bureaucratic function is less important. I've been worried about SMC because for years, according to the Air Force, lots of billets from lieutenant through colonel have been understaffed because many Air Force officers didn't want to go there, apparently because of a weak school system. And I've made fun of some of the Air Force folks saying, for 20 or 30 years this has happened, and you're going to blame our lack of space capability on the fact of a weak school system in a part of Los Angeles? But that's how bureaucracy can work. Nobody identified the problem, nobody solved the problem, and there are different ways to solve the problem. Ideally, we need a good school system in all parts of the country, but if you can't do that, at least do not injure U.S. space capability by having a domestic infrastructure problem like that. But see, those sorts of things happen. They happen in any line of business, and somebody with executive responsibility needs to see that, notice that, and take appropriate action. But Congress is largely like a board of directors. We should not micromanage, but we should never fail to point out problems that are real problems that should be fixed. And that's part of our oversight responsibility that we need to be more diligent in conducting. And it's not just us. Many of these problems have been pointed out since 2001, the Rumsfeld Commission report, 2008, the Allard Commission report. But no one apparently was willing to take action and follow up. So you can still fault Congress for being slow and on taking up this responsibility. But we're doing it now. Let's see it through. And this NDAA, I think, will be the one that sees that through.
All right. And as part of the Space Force proposal that's been submitted to Congress, DoD is also doing some other reorganizations around space. So one is they're standing up U.S. Space Command, but they're also proposing the Space Development Agency. So questions from the audience here. So first of all, in Space Command, what do you say to some of the arguments that people are making that, why isn't it sufficient to just create a combatant command for space, recreate a combatant command for space? Why do you also need a military service?
Well, the Pentagon has its own preferred ways of doing things, and in general it involves, as you pointed out already, more four-star generals. And that's fine. I want people to be rewarded for good work, but there should be basically pay for performance. If you do a great job, fine, be rewarded. If you don't, well then maybe not so much. The command is the easiest way for the military to think about things, because that's a little bit like the fighter jock attitude, the leather jacket and Top Gun and you're cool. Space is a very different environment, and as you know, with coding and programmers and these unmanned vehicles, it's a little bit more like the Silicon Valley software nerd thing. And we need a career path for those people as well, because some of them can be extraordinarily brilliant, but not necessarily love to do their PT requirements every morning. Not necessarily want to laser off their tattoos or get rid of their earrings or whatever. But what matters is ability, and we have to be able to include those folks in our military and reward them. So I think there are ways to do this. The Space Development Agency will probably get a lot of attention, but in general, the Missile Development Agency has worked pretty well. Again, as a detour around regular Air Force, and then we forget that, hey, we should be fixing regular Air Force at the same time, because these 5,000 acquisition authorities are mind-bogglingly complex. But see, a lot of folks have careers that are vested in that stuff. In general, there needs to be a whole Augean stables type cleanup. And Chairman Thornberry and now Chairman Smith have been very much for acquisition reform. But this is a gargantuan task. But our military friends could help us do this, because surely there are people in the bowels of the Pentagon who recognize what needs to be fixed and can come to us with ways of doing that. But for an outsider, especially one who's not acronym versed, it is just an endless minefield of confusion and obstruction, which oftentimes benefits certain commercial interests, because virtually every bid is protested now, and that's part of the process you have to build in. Multi-year delays after the contract has been awarded. It's like, did this happen in World War II? I don't think so. We need to get back to basics and quality and speed.
And on the Space Development Agency, the Air Force has pretty publicly expressed some skepticism about the necessity of it, and one of the arguments has been that the Space Development Agency would be redundant with other offices within the Air Force. What's your view on that? Do you think it's redundant? Do you think it's necessary?
Well, the Air Force basically has fought this from the get-go and not been tuned in to the Rumsfeld or the Allard recommendations. And I'm not faulting them for that. And turf can be a legitimate interest, but I'm really not seeing a whole lot beyond turf that's really what they're defending. We've had some significant slownesses and gaps in performance, and we're not here to fault people, but let's get it going here. There are ways to do this. So the person who most recently said the SDA is irrelevant or redundant, it will soon be leaving. I think that will clear a path for more positive thinking. That, what matters is fielding the capability quickly, affordably, and in a quality way, and we can do that. We must be able to do that. So, as I said earlier, whatever it takes to get to that result, we need to do. And I want to give the Air Force and the Pentagon flexibility and their preferred bureaucratic method for doing that, and call it what they want to. What matters is capability.
And so, one of the things that Congress and DoD have done to get a little more transparency on space funding within the Pentagon budget is they created a new major force program, MFP-12 they call it, for space, where they basically aggregate up all the space-related funding in the budget. Unfortunately, with all of the major force programs, there's not a lot of transparency on the outside to what program lines are being tagged and going in to make up that total MFP. I see Jamie Morin over here in the front row, so I'm going to blame CAPE for that. But it's a long-standing problem that there's, on the outside, there's not full transparency in what goes into the MFPs. Is that a problem for you? Is that a problem for Congress in conducting effective oversight to know where the space dollars are being spent, or do you feel that you have adequate insight?
Well, the problem of communicating with the Pentagon is a difficult one because, in a vast bureaucracy, there are restraints to communication. I've actually found that your work, Todd, here at CSIS has been among the most helpful. Like when you plotted out the possible costs of different types of Space Force, that was extraordinarily helpful. And I learned that there's possibly even something out there that could be more expensive than Heather Wilson's $13 billion. Who knew? But I don't know, is there something beyond gold plating? Is that platinum plating or something? Or palladium plating, perhaps? But think tanks can help us greatly by ferreting out this information, because sometimes the juiciest bits are the most hidden. That's sometimes the way bureaucracy works. Congress hides the ball sometimes too. So I'm not exempting ourselves from responsibility, but that's part of the give and take, the chase, the hunt of oversight, is to find out what should be noticed, because very few people are going to fess up and say, hey, I did something bad here, catch me, or I made a mistake here, punish me. And the goal here isn't punishment. It's high quality performance, and whatever it takes to do that, we can do. This is America, folks. This is the greatest country that has ever existed. And our challenge is just to keep it that way. We didn't have to found it. All we have to do is keep the momentum going. That shouldn't be that hard. And with the exciting stuff we were hearing from Bill Roper, that's pretty amazing. I think there's a whole new generational opportunity here to refocus on some of these things we've forgotten about. But for a while, our nation abandoned big science. We turned our backs on space. We forgot the big, exciting projects of humanity. And this is an opportunity to do that, and to do it in a humane and safe way. This is a magnificent opportunity for a new generation. Let's seize it, and seize it now. There are ways to do this. And even with all of our problems, we can do this. To have all these opportunities put out for us, and you say the cost, well, it might be $1 or $2 billion. Sadly, in the Pentagon budget, that is budget dust. And I'm not saying go ahead and spend or waste that money. Let's spend it wisely. But it's incredible what can be accomplished and what needs to be accomplished right now, because a number of our most precious things are under threat.
So can you tell me a little bit about your working relationship with your counterparts on the other side of the aisle. Now the Democrats are back in the majority in the House. Previously 2 years ago when the Space Corps proposal was put forward, you were on the minority side. You're working very closely, joined at the hip with Representative Rogers on this issue. What's your relationship like now with Representative Turner, who opposed, he was one of the few people who opposed the Space Corps proposal in the past. How's that relationship now, and how do you see his views on this issue?
Well, Todd, you're being very diplomatic. He said he was one of the few people who opposed it. He was the only one who opposed it. I mentioned that 60-to-1 vote. He was the one. But that does not mean he's a bad person. That means he had the courage to stand up for himself and oppose the vast majority of both parties. I think the climate has changed a little bit. I mentioned earlier on that when President Trump came out in favor of the Space Force, that turned a lot of heads around, both in the Air Force and in the Senate, and maybe one or two in the House. But I can't speak for my colleague. So far, he's been a pleasure to work with. I was sorry, this is our district work period. He wasn't able to come here today, but we try to do things in a completely fair, open, and collaborative basis. Because what matters is solving problems for the country, not creating new problems because you're in politics. And so many of my colleagues seem so focused on creating new problems, we don't have time to solve the old ones. This is actually a fun job if you try to fix problems, but it takes a workman-like attitude. And first you diagnose the problem, then you find a remedy. And there are ways to do this, and so far Mike Turner has been extraordinarily helpful that way. His district includes Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, great research outfits like NASIC. He's well-versed in a lot of these issues. He has been head of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He's got a good international perspective that way. There are really positive opportunities to work very, very well together, and as I say, so far, been no problems whatsoever. So I look forward to that continuing because it's for the good of the country and the world. And who's against that?
And so do you think Representative Rogers would make a good Secretary of the Air Force?
Well, his career is his career. As I learned from visiting him in Alabama when I went to the Talladega 500, it's a different country down there.
So says the man from Tennessee to a guy from Mississippi.
Well,
Alabama's different.
Yeah. It is different. Now, we're jealous of their football program, but no, Mike is an extraordinarily great member of Congress. Now he's ranking on Homeland Security, which is an extremely important responsibility. And I think there are great things in his future.
All right. The Air Force is pushing ahead with a follow-on to the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program. They're now calling, I think the name is the National Security Space Launch. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the acquisition strategy that they're using for that. So the phase that we're in right now, I forget if it's phase 1 or phase 2 right now, they have narrowed it down to 3 companies that are in it. And the next step in this acquisition process is they're going to narrow it down to 2 companies, and then they're going to give a block buy. I think it's over a 5-year period to just those 2 companies. Other companies that haven't made it through this down select won't be part of that selection process necessarily. So when they narrowed it down to 3 companies, SpaceX was not one of them. What's your thought on that acquisition strategy, and should it proceed as the Air Force is currently planned? Do you think it needs to be modified? And what do we need to do to make sure we have competition and assured access to space?
Well, launch has been a very contentious area. As you know, it's been very much scrutinized, and I think partly because of the hobbies of billionaires as they've undertaken space as kind of a side activity. We should be thankful for that. And one thing that I'm curious about is if the Bezoses do get a divorce, will there then be a his and hers Blue Origin program? I've heard of his and hers towels after you, but never his and hers space programs. I actually think while it's exciting that these billionaires have this fascination with space and have been so helpful in funding a lot of development that otherwise would not have occurred, and a lot of risk-taking that would have not have occurred. We have to ask ourselves, they were all able to do this basically on their own dime, and sometimes meet or beat or exceed U.S. capabilities. That's a real wake-up call for us. Now, it's by friendly billionaires, or we hope they're friendly, but yikes. I look forward to the day when there's a government acquisition program, whether it's in launch or anything, that dazzles the private sector. Now, we're lucky in this country, we have strong both, but for a long time now, it's been the government is slow. Our delays are so great that we'll buy 20-year-old technology and it'll be launched years from now. That's not good enough anymore. And the speed, the focus of the private sector is something that we need to learn from. So I think there are opportunities here. There was a lot of pushback on the selection process of the Air Force. I don't claim to understand the ins and outs of that. The key is that we get a vastly superior capability in a hurry at an affordable price. And whatever it takes to do that, we're not favoring one company or another. We just want the capability for the nation. So you hope that the program managers and the folks in the Air Force are making fair decisions. In some past acquisition processes, they haven't necessarily done that. We've had some hiccups and mistakes. So that's the key thing, as I've mentioned several times today, reforming the entire Pentagon acquisition process. But that's too big to take on all at once. Maybe we can start with a service. Maybe we can start with an area within the service. And for many people, this was not an encouraging mile marker or signpost for the Air Force in this competition.
So back to the space reorganization question, another question here from the audience. Does it concern you that the proposed Space Force military service under the Department of the Air Force does not include the NRO and other intel-related space functions?
Not only doesn't it concern me, that's one of the positive virtues of the proposal. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Best we can tell, the NRO is not broken. Don't mess it up. Keep it out of the limelight. It's amazing. There are many things that work extraordinarily well in the federal government, but unfortunately for various rules, we're not supposed to talk about them a whole lot. NRO is probably one of those, although nobody should get a free pass forever. You always have to be continually scrutinizing what's going on. But it very much worried me when the President's proposal wanted to wrap up all these three-letter agencies into one in space. That's not a good idea, because they have benefited greatly from flat management organizations, centralized decision-making authority, being able to put things up in space in a year or two instead of 7 or 8 years. That's a huge thing, and then the capabilities are extraordinary. So this is something to very much be proud of, and I wish we could talk about it more. But it's a virtue that the NRO is not in this overall proposal.
It's worth noting that the NRO is one of the few parts of DoD that's passed a clean audit.
Hallelujah. Yeah, that's only been a 20 or 30-year process. And one of the most embarrassing things when your own GAO points out every year that the Pentagon is one of the most risk-prone areas of all of federal government. Didn't the Marines get a clean audit? If the Marines can't do it, I don't know. But it's kind of amazing that our systems are so degraded. And part of it is legacy software systems, part of it's just stubbornness, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you won't measure it, then maybe you don't deserve to manage it. And accounting standards aren't the only thing, but they are a way of making sure that things are coherent and strong. And we really need to focus on that. That sounds like a green eye shade concern, but the Pentagon has been a standout problem, and I think they only spent $1 billion last year trying to get audited. And while they failed, they said that was actually a plus, not a minus. Well, tell a Fortune 500 company that. And that shows how vastly different the standards are of government and of business. It's just taken for granted in business that you do this and keep your books. We've got to do a much better job of keeping the government's books. OCO, as I mentioned earlier, is an outstanding example of that. That's a shameful thing on our budget. And now with the President's latest proposal, you not only double the OCO account to hide the total spending amount, but half of it is actually designated as a base, which just is admitting your problem. It's called base OCO now, which should be a contradiction in terms. This is like jumbo shrimp. This is like, what's going on here? But that shows how out of control a process can become. In addition to the president's, yo-yoing, first Pentagon was going to go down to 700, then that's up more like 750. It's like, that shouldn't happen in an organized country.
I got a question here from online, and I'll tell you that I hear this all the time, so I want to give you the chance to address it. The question is, would the establishment of a Space Force mean that the U.S. plans to use space for military purposes?
Well, people need to remember Sputnik was the first use of space, and that was a Russian or Soviet military operation. In general, for the last many decades, space has been entirely benign and non-military. In fact, one of our problems right now is so many of our satellites are so peaceful they're not in any way protected. We had hoped that space would not be taken advantage of. But with the Chinese ASAT in 2007 and some other developments, sadly, that is looking like it's no longer true. So we need to be able to have an extraordinary defensive capability, and possibly an offensive one. But so the U.S. are not the bad guys here. This is one reason I've been pointing out the fact that free GPS for the world, free air traffic management control, which probably should be spun out of the Air Force and put in a civilian agency, so it's a little bit more like the FAA or a more civilian-oriented place. So no one wants Star Wars, no one wants to militarize space, but what we do have to do is keep our assets safe and keep them safe for the world. And that's an entirely benign and benevolent activity.
So a few budget-related questions here as we wrap up. I know we're starting to run out of time, but it is budget season. So what's your view on the Budget Control Act budget caps? Do you think Congress is going to end up lifting the caps, raising the caps to a higher level like they have in all previous years since the BCA has been in effect? Or do you think this is going to come down to the wire and use of some sort of an OCO gimmick to get around the budget caps?
Well, the number I'm hearing for defense is $733 billion, and the caps will be lifted to whatever would allow that. This problem between defense and domestic, it will be settled by people above my pay grade. $733 billion is a very good number. We can live within that. Sadly, I think the budget process in the House and Senate have entirely broken down. Neither the House nor the Senate are likely to pass a budget. But remember, what we call a budget in the United States really isn't a budget anyway. It's a one-year political fix that in no way obligates the next Congress to, even the next session of Congress, to follow those numbers. And as I've mentioned already, when you have OCO and other off-budget financing in there, the budget is really a shambles anyway. So I look forward to the day when we can get back to more orderly processing. I do think this year could set a record in terms of passage of appropriations bills. The goal on the House side is to have all the appropriations bills, probably using the minibus approach, have them done by like June 30th. That hasn't happened in a long, long time. Now we can't control the Senate, no one can, but that would be a darn good start for the House to get that out there, and perhaps might shame the Senate. Little advertisement here. I had a bill, it's the most unpopular bill in Congress, called No Budget, No Pay. But it actually became law in 2013, and that year, as a miracle, even the Senate passed a budget, because it turns out that even senators like to be paid. And it's not just for budgeting, it's also for passage of appropriations bills. That fundamental pay for performance concept really works. And Congress is one of the few bodies on earth, a few places to work on earth where you can be paid and not do your work. Well, in my opinion, that shouldn't happen. Now, we haven't been able to make that law again. When John Boehner picked up my proposal and helped it become law, he mainly did it for venal political reasons. But if that were to be a permanent principle, and by the way, this isn't so outlandish. The California legislature, the New York legislature It's routine for them. If they can do it, surely we can do it. But that would ensure that the work of the nation gets done more on time and that we don't have terrible atrocities like the Budget Control Act. Because I think as Admiral Mueller pointed out one time, the greatest enemy the Pentagon faces sometimes isn't any foreign enemy. It's the U.S. Congress when we refuse to budget appropriately and on time, and sometimes we make them live with CRs. You cannot run programs on that basis. So I think that Congress is getting the message on this, and I think that this year we'll have a pretty much assured $733 billion defense budget.
And last question from the audience. In the past, when we had earmarks, that tended to be the grease that made the budget wheels turn. Do you think that Congress should bring back earmarks, and would that help get back to regular order?
Earmarks can be managed properly, but it's unlikely that they will be managed properly after the first year or so of reintroduction. We fought so hard, and I'm one of the strongest anti-earmark folks in Congress, to get rid of for example, the Duke Cunningham temptations or the Todd Young temptations, because pretty soon these are not peer-reviewed, pretty soon they get completely out of control, and pretty soon they become a national embarrassment, if not an invitation to corruption. So in general, government spending needs to be well policed, and no dollar should be spent that's not worth spending. And to give each individual member of Congress a small slush fund to grease their own reelection, because that's really what it's about, is a shameful process. Now there is an argument, well, the executive branch does it all the time, so we should have Article I powers to be as bad as the executive branch. Well, that is not a good argument in my book, so let's clean it up on both sides of government. But as I say, while it's theoretically possible to police this, which was probably done 20, 30 years ago, in modern times, the standards have become so degraded that if you want a swimming pool in your district or an interstate interchange across the country in someone else's district, that becomes a suitable subject for an earmark. That is wrong. That is a misuse of taxpayer money. That erodes support for people paying their taxes when they see these abuses, because you know they'll be highlighted by the newspapers. So let's not do this. But the pressure is growing, because as people find difficulty passing bills, they want to buy votes in Congress, just like the congressmen who get earmarks want to buy votes back home. This is wrong. This is not the way things should be done. I don't want to be too much of a Boy Scout, but let's have arguments on the merits, and let's have the best argument win, not the person with the most money. This is really a challenging moment for the legislative branch, and I'm hopeful we'll be able to resist this temptation.
Well, Congressman, our time is up. I want to thank you for joining us. It was a real pleasure to have you here. And everyone, please take a coffee break, and we will start back with Secretary Shanahan, 9:55.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Defense and National Security work here at CSIS and hold the Kissinger Chair. And it's my pleasure to introduce Acting Secretary of Defense Pat Shanahan. He has been serving previously as the 33rd Deputy Secretary of Defense since July of 2017, and he previously served as Boeing's Senior Vice President for Supply Chain and Operations. After Acting Secretary Shanahan's remarks, he'll be joined on stage by Todd Harrison for some back and forth, and then there'll be hopefully some time for some audience Q&A. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Acting Secretary Shanahan.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's certainly good to be here, and I just want to maybe make a few broad comments. Kath, thank you so much. Kath was very involved with the National Defense Strategy Commission, did an outstanding job, and then Todd Harrison, thank you for the invitation. I think John Hamry's not here, but only at CSIS could we have these types of dialogues, which are really so important for these very, very critical issues as we think about what does the future look like. And before I dive into my remarks, one thing I would just ask all of you to do tonight, this would be a little bit of help, say a prayer for our men and women in the military, say a prayer for the civilians that support them. They do remarkable work on our behalf, and the one word that I've learned a lot of words since working in the Department of Defense, but the one word that I've really come to appreciate and understand is the word devotion, and they're devoted to their mission, and they just do a remarkable job. I'm going to tell a story, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Space Force, but let me start with this story, and it's a story about making change and modernizing in the largest bureaucracy in the world. Sometimes people say the department isn't bold or fast enough. But in just 18 months, we went from a phone call with 2 bipartisan members of Congress to a proposal establishing a new branch of the armed services, the Space Force. And I want to talk to you about that proposal today. Representatives Coopers and Rogers got us started on this path, and I want to thank them for their leadership and vision. I also want to acknowledge the important role President Trump played in instilling a sense of urgency in the department, or what Secretary Mattis would call moving at the speed of relevance in establishing the Space Force as the 6th branch of the military. You only get this kind of action if there is a compelling need to move quickly. This was true for our challenges in space. My goal, and the department's goal, is to grow what we call our margin of dominance in space. This margin is now contested, and our legacy systems, as you well know, are not designed to operate in this environment. China and Russia already treat space as a warfighting domain. China is moving fast to grow their presence in space. Last year, their government put 38 rockets into orbit. This is more than double the 17 that our government launched. What's more, the space industry is undergoing a seismic transition fueled by the convergence of commercial and military capabilities, decreasing launch costs, and an entrepreneur-driven innovation. Innovation that impacts the entire space ecosystem, from the hardware in the sky to the application of space-based communications, sensing and precision navigation and timing data on the Earth. During this state of evolution, we can't afford to lose our margin of dominance. What is vital is that we protect a $19 trillion economy and the systems our military runs on. As Representative Cooper said, if our satellites were attacked, we would be blind, deaf, and impotent before we even knew what hit us. Everything from ATM machines to Zumwalt destroyers would be paralyzed. If you're faced with threats like this, you say yes to change. And so we make a strategic choice to organize to ensure American dominance in space for decades. This choice to restructure has three parts: a military service, combatant command, and a development agency. Let's talk about part one, the U.S. Space Force. To move forward effectively, space needs an advocate. That advocate will be the Space Force. The Space Force will operate like other branches of the armed services, organizing, training, and equipping the force with Title X authorities. It will have formalized leadership, including a new Undersecretary for Space and a Chief of Staff of the Space Force, to focus on developing space warfighting doctrine and culture. The organization will also focus on professional development, developing skills within the force, and creating a pipeline of space experts. It won't be very large, between 15 and 20,000 people, and it will have a budget the size of SOCOM. Let me spend a moment and talk about U.S. Space Command, which is the second part of our restructuring. Space Command will change the mission of space from a support function to a leading role. This is not new. This is a bit of back to the future, since we previously had Space Command but gave it up after 9/11 for NORTHCOM. The commander will wake up every morning thinking two things: how am I going to win in space? And how will space help the joint force win in the land, sea, air, and cyber domain? I'll touch on the Space Development Agency, which is the third part, and in my view, the pacing element. Our space presence will be enabled by new capabilities delivered by the Space Development Agency. There are roughly 2,500 active satellites on orbit today. American companies alone project they will add 15,000 satellites in the next decade or so. The proliferation is primarily happening in LEO, with small sats focused on mostly communications and ISR. But the low cost of launch is expanding access to all orbits. Additionally, in the next decade, we expect to see commercially available, persistent surveillance of the globe from space. We need to leverage this commercial space investment and tap into the advancements to help solve the next generation of warfighting challenges. There are different models for the department to follow. We can acquire commercial off the shelf. We can tailor commercial solutions. We can develop new technologies or some hybrid of the aforementioned. And in parallel, we need our warfighters to experiment with new space-based applications. There are 3 points I really want to underscore here. The first, the unifying factor is the need for advanced systems engineering as we design for artificial intelligence, as we design to enable low latency movement of data, as we design to connect sensor to shooter, and as we design to enhance exquisite capabilities. Second, if we do nothing, I'll just say this again, if we do nothing and maintain our legacy approach, at least 10 DoD organizations working on space-based capabilities and architecture will continue to develop bespoke solutions. And third, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to recapitalize the department's space architecture and integrate it, to deliver new solutions at scale. Our rules aren't adaptive enough to leverage this. We need one organization in the lead to enable a department solution. So let me conclude with a few short comments. These reorganizations all tie to our national defense strategy and the overarching need to posture for great power competition in space. But beyond this reorganization, the President's defense budget request also includes a 15% increase in our investment in space-based capabilities. The Space Development Agency roadmap from the 1601 report has 8 increments of capability, and it provides a path for buying down risk and delivering capability so that we can scale and take action. The roadmap starts with hypersonics, tracking and warning for defense against adversary hypersonic missiles, with the next step to provide targeting for our hypersonic missiles. The roadmap delivers an alternate PNT so that we can operate in a GPS-jammed environment. These are just a few of the investments in our 2020 budget request. The institutional changes in money increase demonstrate our resolve to move out and find a solution. 18 months ago, it was a phone call. 14 months ago, it was a rollout of the National Defense Strategy. 9 months ago, we received presidential guidance. Last month, it was a Space Force proposal. This month, it is a budget. This is what it means to compete. The Space Force is a critical part of ensuring we dominate in an era of great power competition. Thank you. Okay, we'll switch.
Here, I can go here. Yeah. That's good. Well, thank you for joining us here, Secretary Shanahan, for your remarks. I want to...
How'd I do?
We're giving a thumbs up? Now for the hard part. I think so. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Oh, let's hit the button. Yeah, let's see. There we go.
All right. Everybody hear me now?
Now we
All right, very good.
Now they can hear you on the web.
This isn't the hard part, this is the fun part, right?
We haven't heard my questions yet.
Yeah, they'll be fun. They'll be good.
So my first question, and I'll remind folks here in the audience and watching online, if you want to ask a question, you can go to the web address you see here, aerospace.csis.org/questions. You submit your question, I'll get it up here on the tablet. But, you know, as the moderator, I get to go first with my question. So first question is, you know, when the president came out with this Space Force proposal almost a year ago now, he talked about it initially as a separate department. What you guys settled on is a separate service within the Department of the Air Force. Can you just tell me a little bit about how that, how the idea evolved and how you settled on this particular construct?
That's a good way to start out today. So, you know, you can imagine if someone said, create a new branch or a new department. As you all recognize, we have lots of processes in the Pentagon, but they didn't have the start the new department process. And so a lot of this is, you know, a bit, you know, homegrown, and you have to think about what is the best organization construct so that you can go the fastest. And a department allows you to have complete autonomy. So on one end of the spectrum, you can have, you know, full autonomy. On the other end of the spectrum, you can say, let's maintain the status quo. And we started with those bookends, and we said, given the need for speed and then how much time you might spend just reorganizing, we landed in a place that said, draw off the synergy of the Air Force. All right, and we have significant learning from the Marine Corps about how to have a service within a department. The biggest thing that we've been working to do with the Space Force is focus on delivering capability faster. And it's very easy in government to think about equities. And we didn't want to start with, well, what are the equities? What are the structures? How do we draw a path to deliver maintaining that margin of dominance? And it really was all based on, you know, standing up these, you know, I'll call it critical time-based capabilities, doing the development. The Space Development Agency is about development. It's not a space acquisition agency, it's a space development. So we said, that's what's most important. And you can put it any place, but given most of the resources that are going to be a component or an element of the Space Development Agency live within the Air Force, keep it as close to that as possible. Space Command was easier.
And what do you say to folks, critics of creating a separate military service that say, well, if you're creating United States Space Command, a combatant command for space, why can't that be enough? Why do you also need a military service? Can't we make Space Command kind of like Special Operations Command and give it some service-like authorities?
I mean, we can do anything, right? I mean, this is what's in terms of working on something. This has been a really great experience because we've got this big piece of clay that we get to work with, and a lot of the critics. So you have people that are at the subatomic level, and they get into, let's move this little piece of the clay, from here to there. I go back to when I came into the department, they said space is really important, and Secretary Rumsfeld back in the early 2000s tried to move the ball. So we're talking about moving the ball. That's the most important piece. I go back to the essence of your question.
So Space Command, why isn't creating a combatant command sufficient?
Well, the Space Command will only get after dealing with space, but not any new tools. The big change is we woke up one day and space was contested, and everything that we had designed for was no longer as capable as we thought. Imagine being able to walk around your neighborhood and never having to lock your door. Well, one day all of a sudden you have to lock your door, and the things that we have on orbit aren't capable of that. And so you say, $19 trillion economy. That's just ours. But everybody runs off of space. So how do we protect ourselves? So the Space Command just gets at, we want somebody every day to think about, are we defending the economy, and do we have someone focused on making sure that the military systems are protected? The most important thing is, now how do you replace that critical infrastructure so that it's resilient, redundant, survivable, and has new capabilities because it really is contested? That is the most critical and pacing item. This is about retiring risk. The structures are interesting. There's lots of ways to go about it, but it's mostly, we put together a roadmap, and the roadmap was about how do we leverage space to reduce threats to the United States. So the first element on the roadmap is, how do we counter hypersonics that are a risk to our men and women and to the homeland? Space is a fantastic place. You're not geographically limited. We've built a space plan around the things we need in order to compete and win against China and Russia.
And so just last week, Chairman Smith and the House Armed Services Committee, he said that they'll take a look at this Space Force proposal, but they're gonna come up with something different on their own within their committee. Have you had discussions yet about what kind of changes they would like to see, or do you have any indications on specific parts of the proposal they're not happy with?
I haven't walked through the proposal with Chairman Smith, but a lot of my interactions on the Hill have gone this way in terms of how we view the threat and the changes we need to make. Pretty universal about being more aggressive, leveraging commercial innovation, removing red tape, doing things for less cost. The feedback I've received is worry about adding or building bigger government. That part has been universal, and I don't blame them. I mean, I think we all want the same thing. We want a lean and a very thoughtful use of resources, but that's generally been the feedback, and the conversations have been like this. Explain to us how you've come up with your costs, or help us to understand why this isn't, a redundant effort.
And, in terms of the bureaucratic politics within the building, so this is something that has basically been in your lap since you came to the Pentagon. You've been working on it, from beginning to end. How have you seen the bureaucratic politics evolve during this time period? Because when the Space Corps proposal came out from Congress in 2017, the Air Force very publicly opposed it, and now DoD is submitting a proposal that's somewhat similar to that. How's that process been, and what are your experiences in dealing with the internal bureaucracy throughout this?
Well, the experience has been like every experience I've ever had where change is involved. It's human nature. Anytime somebody proposes something different, until you understand the why and the how, there's a lot of questions that you have to kind of work your way through. But human nature is, perpetuate the status quo. Something that is a significant change represents uncertainty. I think when we started on this journey, there wasn't a lot of definition. There was a lot of top-down direction. And as we've moved along and talked about the problems we want to solve and how we want to solve them, there's been less pushback. The pushback now comes in the flavor of, well, why not do it this other way? Or this might be a better approach. But if you step back and think about what we're trying to do in the department, is we haven't modernized in 30 years. The muscles we have aren't for modernization. I mean, this is about doing something very different. And so the first reaction is, well, that's not what we've been doing, or we're not resourced to do this. So I think this is characteristic of the changes we'll see as we continue to evolve things when it comes to hypersonics or cyber. It's a lot of these domains, but this is our 30-year window. Every 30 years you decide you're going to make a change, and takes people, you've got the fence sitters, you've got the people that really want to drive it, and then some folks just never want to do it. But I think now you're starting to see momentum, because we've been resourced, because we've been consistent with our strategy, and because people truly do recognize the security environment.
And so, question from the audience here. The House is probably going to be the easier chamber to get this proposal through in some respects, since they've considered this in the past and voted on it. But the Senate is largely unknown what they would do. They haven't actually debated a proposal like this in the past, like the House has. So, we had invited Senator Inhofe. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. But, what's your message to Senator Inhofe, Senator Fisher, and others on the Senate Armed Services Committee on, why they should support this? Because they have been somewhat skeptical in the past. What's your elevator speech for them on why they should get on board, why this is necessary right now?
Well, I'll give you the elevator speech in a second here, but what I've found with Congress as a whole is a willingness to be persuaded. People have lots of positions. What I've found in my short time here is that when we spend our time talking about interests, that's when people are open-minded to being persuaded. And I think the compelling piece here is that $19 trillion economy and the military run on space. And we need to have confidence that we're really protecting that. And then we start to talk about how do we develop and field the capability. And that's really when we sit down and we talk about we can develop it this way or we can develop it this other way, that becomes the selling point. But it gets a little bit technocratic, and I think for most people what they want to do is have their staffs educated, that this isn't, that we're not falling into some acquisition trap. I think that if I was to characterize the difference on our approach here is that, and what we should spend our time talking about is, how does this tie back to Space Command? If you think about what we've been doing for the last 30 years. It's really more acquisition or kind of running our process. This is getting back to how do we do development. It is new muscle movement. So we really, we can't do acquisition. We have to do development. And if you said you have a small window, we don't have 10 years to do this. We have, the money's not always going to be there. So you have a window of time in which you're going to do something. So you fundamentally have to ask the question, do we reorganize over 5 years and resolve all our acquisition inefficiencies and figure out how to leverage the industrial base? Or, would we look at this through the lens that General Schriever would look at? He'd say, what we'd do is we'd say, get people that have technical chops, who've had a history with acquisition, that understand a clear threat, and let them do their job. And what I've found in the department is when we enable people to go do that, we have wonderful results. My comment about 10 different architectural studies going on, why would we want to do that? I know what's going to happen. We're going to come up with 6 or 7, and then we'll end up morphing them over time, and we'll end up spending more money. We'll argue in the near term about some bureaucratic costs, but the real cost of development is the area we want to keep our eye on.
And so, speaking of cost, another question from the audience here is, in this budget proposal, it lays out a cost of $2 billion over 5 years for standing up a Space Force. That's the new cost of standing it up. And some in Congress and outside of Congress have said that no, they actually think it'll end up being more than that. So, what's your confidence in the cost estimate, and how does it differ from the $13 billion estimate that we got from the Air Force back in September?
I think the Air Force estimate had just different assumptions. And I think over time it had growth factored into it. I'd say our $2 billion number is a good parametric estimate. It's really more of a top-down number than it is a bottoms-up number, and for the purposes of moving at speed, you parametrically generate a number. But in the department, we're really going to do a bottoms-up approach to cost. Cost grows if you don't limit it. So to me, it would be like we need to cap it. If we do the top-down approach in terms of normal equities, of traditional structures, I think it'll probably grow. That's what normally happens. I think we have to be very thoughtful. But remember that this is much smaller. So when somebody says, well, we're going to start a new service, you start to think about, well, like the Army, with 500,000 people. We're talking 15,000 to 20,000 people defending $19 trillion. When we make a mistake in development, we're talking billions. So, part of this is, and I'm very sensitive, we need to be very mindful about creating bureaucracy because it endures for a long time. I think we'll get the cost piece right. We've got to get the development piece tracking sooner and more quickly.
So the next question here is, when standing up a Space Force, obviously most of the unclassified military space assets belong in the Air Force, but the Navy and the Army have some substantial space capabilities as well. So is the intent that you would move over those Navy and Army space capabilities, and what would the timeline for that be?
Yeah, this is the normal part of change where people worry about, because when we talk about organizing, it's immediate. Well, what's going to happen to me? Does my home office change? Am I out of a job? Does my job move? And the way we've really been looking at going more quickly is against the roadmap we put in the 1601 report. So I would, at a high level, say in the short term, legacy is legacy. So why would we burn a lot of calories, moving things that are working today into some new organization. It's at some point there's some realignment that just makes sense, but it really is how, with new authority and getting after the threat, how do we organize for that? Now, what I would argue is within the resources we have today, there are a whole bunch of people, if we said, would you like to join this team? They'll kick the door down and say, can I join? And again, remember, we're not talking huge numbers, but we're talking about making a huge difference that has a huge impact on the economy that we're protecting.
So, next question.
You guys all look so serious. This is a good day, right? Yeah. This is such a good subject. I mean, this is about the future. You know what I mean? We're working on the future.
So next question is, some of the differences between this new Space Development Agency and existing acquisition organizations like the Space and Missile Systems Center within the Air Force. So how do you view in the near term kind of the division of responsibility between these organizations?
Well, we'd talk about it maybe at a macro level. I mean, we're still working through the details. When I talk with General Thompson, again, what we don't want to do is disrupt the work that they're doing today. And General Thompson has been going through a transformation program called SMC 2.0, and the team down there continues to take cost and risk and shorten flow time. So hats off to them. I would say there it's whether it's a carve out of some of the capability that they have, whether it's a drawing on the resources, they're an element of the Space Development Agency. What I think everybody here in this room should recognize is the talent and capability in the SMC is unbelievable. And as you go around the department, the technology and the talent is extraordinary. This is about how do we harness it in this short term. I go back to, what would General Schriever do? And that's just our task at hand. I mean, there's a scope of work that we have to undertake. We need to preserve the capabilities that are in place. I mean, I think when people hear about the proposal, they think we're going to drop the existing structures, run away from them, and we'll be in a free fall. That is not the case. This is about a carve out so that we can go faster against hypersonics. This is a carve out so we can do more in missile defense more quickly. This is a carve out so that we can draw, the NDAAs, when you read them, it's do things that are more innovative, tap into the industrial base, cut red tape of the DoD 5000. We're not going to do the whole space mission, but there are segments now. If we leverage less red tape and the huge investment that's been made in commercial space, we can go a lot further for less more quickly.
Another question here, I'm seeing several from the audience, basically relating to the interaction between the Space Force proposal and NASA and human space flight. And so I know from reading the proposal, NASA is not part of it, would not be part of the Space Force, there'd be no human space flight in it. But can you just elaborate on that, that there is this distinction, and would this change that in any way?
It does, and that's it's part of the calculus, the change calculus. So if you said, let's pick up NASA, let's do all the intel organizations, let's do legacy. I mean, we'd be dead on arrival. This is later on, as we're successful, people are going to want to hitch a ride, And if we're not, I mean, I'd prefer to stand on our success. We've had wonderful conversations with the intelligence organizations, and they go like this: let's technically be aligned. Let's make sure we think about architectures. Organization, that happens later. It's always complicated. But let's make sure in terms of the capability we're going to harness together later, we've laid the pipe and we've provisioned for those things. That alignment's in place. The arguments we're going to have about lines and boxes on charts, we've tried to push off for another day, not because they're unimportant. We don't need to have those discussions right now. We have to move out against some of these threats, and we can, independent of those discussions, but with an eye towards how these pieces come together later. Success will bring those other pieces together, and because there's, the 5 years from now, because of what we can do with data and these new environments, these organizations are going to naturally change. So it's about putting that in place. The other part will follow. I mean, you just look around the world, every place where people start to have better information, their organizations change. So instead of having that debate, do the work, and then that will naturally occur.
So, speaking more broadly about innovation within the Department of Defense, some, the high-tech companies have shown a reluctance to work with DoD, to work with the military. Do you see that as a lingering problem, as something that the department needs to address?
I do. We're real hard to work with. I don't know if you guys think that, but it's not just hard, it's expensive. I mean, we, for a lot of good reasons, we ask people to produce certain information or, use certain processes, but all those things add costs. And if you're somebody who's using their own money or investors' money, and you have, opportunity to pursue something commercially or with the government, it really does cause people to pause. So I would say, and Secretary Lord understands this, is one of the things she's working on, is how do we make it easier to do business with the government. But I've heard this from investors, entrepreneurs, small business owners. They're very clear. We have great stuff for you to use, but it's just really hard to work with you, and it takes too long.
And so, last question for you. How are you adjusting to the new job, the acting secretary, and what kind of surprises have you seen so far in this new position?
God, I've seen a lot of surprises. When I think about the job, and what's really important right now is continuity and being able to stick to the national defense strategy. I would say it's a year ago that we rolled out the strategy, but we've really been working to the strategy for about 18 months. And we've been resourced to the strategy. And what I think you would find really encouraging is there's a tremendous amount of alignment within the department. I think it's not like the biggest surprise. It's the thing that gets me up in the morning. It makes me really excited. Is we can win this game. I mean, we have the people and we have the resources. There's a lot. As everyone knows, you pick up the newspaper. There's a lot going on in the world today, and especially in this town. I'm really encouraged by the talent and the opportunity that we have in front of us. We'll push through all the challenges. I mean, that's life in a very complicated world. But I think the biggest surprise for me is the commitment and the unwavering dedication to implementing the National Defense Strategy.
Secretary, I know our time is up. I want to thank you for joining us here at CSIS. And folks, please keep your seats until the Secretary's had a chance to exit
All
the
right,
building.
great. Thank you, everybody.
The button. The button works. The button works. I think we're ready to resume, folks. Good morning. My name is Steve Jakes. I am the Acting Executive Director of the National Security Space Association. I figure if we can have an Acting Secretary of Defense, we can have an Acting Executive Director of the National Security Space Association. On behalf of NSSA, we are really pleased to have this opportunity to partner with CSIS. Todd and your team, you all have been great to work with. We really appreciate being a part of today's important event. We've all heard some really important golden words this morning from our nation's top leaders in this area. And we all know there's a lot of critically important work ahead to undertake, which brings me to talk briefly about NSSA's contribution. Industry really plays an important role in the national security space enterprise, and NSSA uniquely brings focused and trusted thought leadership to the table. Our vision is clear. We're dedicated and focused to inspire, support, and advance government-industry cooperation and collaboration in the national security space. We are only about national security space as a nonprofit. So the heart and soul of our association centers around our Studies and Analysis Center that deals with the intersecting intricacies of policies, programmatics, politics, acquisition, operation, the holistic approach to things. And we're very blessed to have in the association, running the Studies and Analysis Center, Mr. Chris Williams, who's the moderator of today's panel. A lot of us have known Chris for a long time. He is a pro in the business. Several years working on Capitol Hill as the House Armed Services Committee professional staffer for all things strategic, space, missiles, et cetera. Deputy Staff Director of the Senate Intelligence Committee staff, once upon a time, was a special assistant for then Secretary Don Rumsfeld on the Inner Circle. And we're very blessed to have him part of our team, and I'm delighted to pass this over to you, Chris, for introducing the staff. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
You bet.
Appreciate it. Well, we're very lucky to have. Thank you for having me, and we're very excited to have a distinguished panel today. I would be remiss however, if I didn't say a quick comment about CSIS Director John Hamre. John, if you're watching, I just want you to know we're thinking about you and praying for you. We have, again, a great group here. In order of the speakers, we have Mike Tierney of VELOS. Mike is one of the top experts in the national security space budget and compiles an annual analysis of funding for military space programs. He previously served as a partner at Fiscal Track and worked on the Hill as a military legislative assistant. Mike has some slides he's going to go through, and then we'll introduce the other speakers consecutively here. After you, Mike.
Thank you, Chris.
Please.
Thank you all for joining us and sticking through here, the last panel. This is the fourth year that we've been doing this. It's grown with our partnership with CSIS. Really appreciate the leadership that they've provided in putting this event on. And thank you to the VELOS team that helped me crash and put myself into a position to speak intelligently here after the budget was only released in detail just a few days ago. So we've been spending, the last 2 days and last week as well, when we got the initial funding numbers, to wrap our minds around what really is in the budget for military space. If you can advance to the next slide for me. So I'm going to start off. You've heard a lot about the Major Force Program for Space, MFP-12. That's the number, generally speaking, when you hear that someone from the department speak about a $14.1 billion space portfolio. Generally speaking, that's going to be tracking to their Major Force Program 12 for national security space. A Major Force Program is basically, an accounting method to aggregate like program elements into a single Major Force Program. It's an inexact science, as you can imagine. Binning a single line that does many things into one of those missions is a challenge. But if you can advance to the next slide. Part of what's motivating the changes that you'll see in the Major Force Program 12 for space is congressional attention to the need for a Major Force Program for space. And so in the fiscal year 16 Defense Authorization Bill, they created a mandate for the department to formalize what had been an informal major force program for space. When we say space programs, it's only the unclassified lines. It's not the MIP, it's not the special access programs. Those are not accounted for, and obviously those can't be tracked in the public basis as well. I've briefed the major force program and why I care about it as a nerd in the nerdery, but it's taken on a little bit more meaning this year because the Space Force proposal projects to move some funding lines into the Space Force. And so the MFP, the Major Force Program for Space, does provide a logical basis from which to draw the space funding lines. They've been spending the last 2 or 3 years identifying what should move in there, and now there's a plan in place to identify what should move out. It's not going to be one-to-one, and it's not an easy game like that, but it allows somebody like me to look at what is in the MFP. Let's baseline that universe of space spending, and then let's look at that year to year, year over year, to see really where the funding's moving. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we've been looking at the budget for the last couple days and basically updating our figures of what is in the MFP, which programs are in it, and what did they get this year. And what we're seeing is consistent with what you're hearing from the department and from the Air Force, which is that there is a substantial increase in funding year over year for space programs. That 22.8% number, that is compared to the 19 request. How much money did those same lines in the 20 budget get in the 20 request in the 19 request is up 22%. If you look at what the department said that they were going to do this year when they made their request last year, it is still up. It's up about 10%. That's saying, you know, we're going to do these programs in FY20. Now the 20 budget comes out. If you compare those two numbers, you're still up 10% across the portfolio. What are the key highlights? Establishment of the United States Space Force, and there is not simply just a legislative proposal that requires changes to the U.S. Code. There is a funding and budget element to that. Funding of the Space Development Agency. There's some new big programs that have been moved out and into their own dedicated program elements, like Enterprise Ground Services. There's a big investment in the next-gen OPIR system and a reflection of congressional direction on how and what to name that and how to fund it. Same on National Security Space Launch, formerly EELV. That has also gotten some significant attention in the budget. PNT, our GPS constellation, the budget funds in this fiscal year 3 space vehicles, 2 in the RDT&E line, that's space vehicles 11 and 12 for GPS, and then the 13th space vehicle of the GPS-3 follow-on constellation is funded in the procurement line this year, which is a new procurement line for the follow-on. And then there's some minor modifications to the structure of what's in MFP 12. Some things moved out and into some of those other MFPs that had been previously moved in into the 12 have now been moved back out, and some things have moved in. Next slide. The 2 real major things that I wanted to just highlight and recap from kind of an objective outsider perspective is what is in the budget for the United States Space Force. There is a legislative proposal, a package that says here are the changes to law that must occur. I've looked at that through line, chapter, and verse. And when they are creating a new Undersecretary of the Air Force for Space or a Chief of Staff of the United States Space Force, they have literally, and I think for good reason, effectively copied and pasted the code section for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Secretary of the Air Force, and basically replicated those authorities in line, code, chapter, verse, with some minor modifications. But there's also a funding element, as you've heard today, that this is the kickoff of funding the Space Force. It's only $72.4 million in terms of actual headquarter authority. And then the real meat and potatoes of all of that money that's going to move over in the future years is projected in their request to occur in the 21, 22, 23, 24 implementation phase. So that's when the programs that are identified in the Major Force Program 12 for Space will leave the Air Force or leave the Army or leave the Navy and actually move into a dedicated budget element for the Space Force. And then you've heard the $2 billion number projected over time. Next slide. Kind of conjoined with that has been the Space Development Agency proposal. And this is something where the department has established the Space Development Agency. Acting Secretary Shanahan's memo was just about a week and a half ago, directive establishing the authority for Space Development Agency, giving it a mandate, giving it a directive. That directive is now matched in budget authority. And this is unique. This is very new in the 20 request. We have new budget elements that are SDA, Space Development Agency budget lines that have had no prior history, obviously, and what those efforts fund is largely what you've heard about relative to the proliferated LEO constellation, and that's really the embodiment of the funding elements on what they're acquiring in the Space Development Agency lines is really relative to that proliferated LEO constellation. The reason I raise this is that if your congressional oversight, if you're Representative Cooper or his counterparts on the appropriations committees, you now have a pretty clear understanding of what are the financial mechanics, at least in this fiscal year, to implement the Space Development Agency and the United States Space Force. I've got 13 more slides that go into the individual mission areas that looks at the program line by line. Obviously, I'm not going to brief that now, but we will be posting that, I think, to the event webpage for you to look at where have been the individual program adjustments, what programs receive more money, less money, and invite you to look at that. But look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Next, we're Laughlin. Sorry. We good? We good? Next, we're pleased to have Kevin McLaughlin, retired Air Force Lieutenant General and former Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. Kevin also served as the Commander of 24th Air Force and Commander of Air Force Cyber. From 2012 to 2013, he served as the Director of Space Operations at Air Force Headquarters and also as a veteran of the Rumsfeld Commission. Kevin, your comments on the proposal for Space Force and
Great, thank you, Chris.
associated issues.
It's great to be with all of you here today. I would like to thank CSIS for hosting us. Not quite 20 years ago, I was a military fellow here at actually at the old headquarters building, and really enjoyed and was honored to work with the academic folks here as well as with Dr. Hammerly. For Steve and the National Security Space Administration or Association, it's awesome to see the work that you're just starting to do, so thanks for hosting us. And for Chris and the panelists, it's great to be with you today. So instead of building you a watch with the punchline at the end, I thought I would just start so you know where I'm coming from, that I am unequivocally supportive and affirm my support for the recommendation that is in the legislative proposal to finally create a separate space service. While long overdue, I think it's a very exciting time, and there are reasons to be full of optimism. We've got the stand-up of many things. You heard Acting Secretary Shanahan talk about the stand-up of the new Unified Command, the Space Development Agency, growing budget, senior leader support at the very highest levels in the White House and in the Pentagon, the Space Service legislative proposal that's been submitted. All great things. And I would say progress and the momentum are eye-watering. And my hat's off to all the folks that have been dedicated to this, as again, the Secretary talked about in such a short period of time, but going back prior, both in the executive and legislative branches, and many of you in the private sector who have been committed to this. You guys have all moved the ball down the field a tremendous way, but we're not in the end zone yet. No spiking of footballs yet. Still much to do, and ultimate success is by no means assured. I testified a few months ago at a meeting of the National Space Council and talked a little bit about my perspective on this going back to the Space Commission days. And I won't recant those things, but I will tell you the emotions were running high at the end of that commission. We felt like, I think all the commissioners felt like they had done a thorough job, and the chairman had just become Secretary of Defense. And so the optimism of lasting change in critical areas was really high, at least for me personally. But for tons of reasons, not any single reason, we find ourselves now 15, 20 years later, and it turns out many of the lasting changes then didn't happen, not to the degree they needed. And in many ways, we're kind of back to the future. So I had become a bit pessimistic on this, and I had actually shared that with the National Space Council. My wife reminded me that I'd always said to folks that a pessimist is just a wounded optimist. And And so my wounds are healed, and I am excited about the future, and I'm glad to be here. I do want to talk to you very quickly about three things. And I very much like to see some old mentors in the audience that I have the greatest of respect for, and I always have tried to emulate being moderate with my words and my tone. But I will tell you today, some of my remarks will be at least more pointed, perhaps, than normal. And I apologize up front if folks don't appreciate that approach. But I'm going to talk about why the right organization and management structure matters, why this is such a big deal, why we need to take the long view. The actions we're going to embark on today is not about getting something in next year's budget. It's about sustaining and keep our nose to the grindstone for potentially another few decades. And then maybe end with a few things on, at least from my perspective, what we might ought to do next. So why is this so important? I think we're here today really because of one central question. That question is whether we need a purpose-built military service whose sole purpose is to defend the United States in the space domain. A domain that's governed by different physical laws and principles that are so different from air, land, sea, and cyber that it requires a different service. I think that's the question. A service solely dedicated to the current and future space missions defined by our civilian military leadership via strategy, policy, and orders. A service solely dedicated to creating a culture of space personnel who will directly influence the development of systems and doctrine needed to defend against the threats of today and tomorrow. A service solely dedicated to applying all of its intellectual energy and all of its resources, whether they're meager or not, towards that core mission. I believe the answer is clearly yes, but it's because military services are about creating culture. They're about creating the people who are dedicated to specific warfighting domains, and those cultures permeate everything in their organization, including those things that we might find the boring little details that really make up what a service does. We often can hurt ourselves in this conversation because we get confused and we think we need a new service because we need to fix acquisition. We need a new service because we need to go fast or we need to be innovative. Those are all things we need to do, by the way. It's not an either or. I'm just saying that's not why you need a separate service. We hurt ourselves because we get distracted by pundits and people who have great standing who say creating a separate service will create stovepipes. It'll hurt integration of space into warfighting. It will distract us from the urgent problems of the day or that it costs too much. The core reason we need a separate service is that we need to build the people who will create a culture laser focused on space as a warfighting domain. And those people need to drive every single process in a new service that produce things like doctrine, personnel management and organization policies, space requirements and budgets, space R&D and acquisition, and space capabilities, all against the ethos of a separate purpose-built military service, again, whose sole purpose is to defend the United States in the space domain. We don't have that today. I grew up until I became a cyber guy. At the end of my career, every fiber of my being was focused on space operations. And I'm proud of that work, and I'm proud of the people that I served under and the missions that we did. But it's not inside an organization that does that. We don't get that by creating a new U.S. Space Command, SMC 2.0, a new space development agency. Those organizations are critical, but they're consumers of what a military service brings. They're consumers of the people and the doctrine and the requirements. The organization responsible for organized training and equipping then provide things to those organizations who then do their mission. And so this is important, and I think we do lose focus at times about why a service is so important. It was even one of the questions, I think, Todd, that you asked the Secretary. Why do we need to take the long view? I know it's hard to do, but taking the long view is important. While decisions we're going to make in the next few months are crucial, it's about maintaining focus and drive over the long term to create a strong and independent national security space organization and management structure inside our country. History shows that every major change in large organizations is difficult. Again, Secretary Shanahan commented on that. He's been in the middle of the knife fight trying to bring this about. But I think sometimes it's useful to look backwards through the lens of history at things where it's a little easier to see. It's interesting to look at the decades-long struggle inside the U.S. Army for what eventually became the United States Air Force, service that many of us in the room served, spent our time in uniform. Inside the DoD, there was a struggle to create U.S. Special Operations Command, which is actually, it is a service-like COCOM. It has some service-like principles. It's not a service, but it has some of those attributes. But it took decades. It took a long time just to decide to do it, and then it was still a struggle, and still is today in some ways, a struggle to make it what it is at the moment. And by the way, not everyone thinks SOCOM is the most wonderful thing in the world. So it does, just because you've achieved some level of culture and focus and mission capability doesn't mean everyone around you just decides it's the best thing in the world. And it's okay. That's not the measure of whether or not it was successful. And I'll tell you that the push to develop a space service, if you look backwards through the lens of history the last 20 years ago to the Rumsfeld Space Commission, I think you would see some of the same struggle, although to this point a little bit less successful than the first two. And I think the real issue is this is going to be hard to do. And it's not going to be hard to do for 12 months. There will be setbacks and seemingly insurmountable challenges that we'll face. People, again, the Secretary talked about the people and the personalities. People in this area are going to face personal risk to their own reputation, to their own careers, and people will step up and will continue to fight for this despite that. So I think the question for us as we think about this long view is, what side of history do you want to be on? It's for anyone that's involved in this directly, where you have any responsibility to execute or to assist or to advise or even to agitate on the side, what side do you want to be on at this point? It is easy. It is the easiest thing to do, to sit on the sidelines and cast stones. It's sometimes fashionable to join the naysayers. I heard them 20 years ago. I hear the same types of things today. This is just a whim of the president. This is just about rearranging deck chairs and creating more bureaucracy. It's about creating an organization with no real purpose or defined mission. I will say it's much harder to be committed to creating something new, especially if you're trying to do it fast and with a singular focus. It makes you vulnerable to criticism. Certainly makes you at times sound or seem like a zealot. I would argue, though, we can't let those reasons keep us from the focus at hand, and that is delivering an organization that is going to solve the problems and mitigate the risks that the Secretary talked about to our country in space. I would say, and I was a little bit more junior officer at the time of the Space Commission, but I feel accountable and responsible just the same, because I played some role in what we were doing. And I will say, looking back through the lens of history 20 years ago, I'm not happy with my own performance, because I was on the wrong side of history. We're sitting today at a place we didn't need to be in. We could have been at a different place. We missed a generational opportunity. In 20 years from now, we don't want to be sitting in that same place. So what should we do now? I certainly think organizations like CSIS and the National Security Space Association and others play a significant role in a bipartisan way, objectively, and with the right blend of dispassionately approaching and with some passion, can educate people on the Hill, can educate the American people, and can bring, perhaps sometimes maybe solutions, can bring compromises, can bring, there's not a single way to do this. And I think we'll have to find ways to get the people that have the authority to say yes or no to this to a place where we still go do the things we need to do. And so I think we should applaud and help organizations like NSSA and CSIS in that mission. I do think we need to be focused on being disruptive in the right areas. I'm making the case that this is not just about acquisition and development, and it's not about a warfighting command only. It is about that hard part, and to be honest, it's the hardest thing in the department, I think, and that's creating new organizations out of others where authorities are moving around to do a mission differently. And I think that's where we need to be disruptive. That's where we need to create a culture where we can kind of incubate the ideas and provide top cover for the people that are going to have to do the work. Last, I would say, and again, really resonated with Secretary Shanahan's remarks about the money. We need to be accountable for every dollar, every single penny as we stand this organization up. If it's not clearly traced to some capability at the back end of this, we should be cautious about spending that dollar. As much as it would be great to have a new space service band and a space service uniform, I've got some drawings at home I'd show you, but it ought to be about, is this going to produce the ability for us to defend our country in space more rapidly or not? And if it's not, then I would be cautious about spending the money. But that means we should, I really liked Todd's question, providing clarity. He asked the Secretary about the cost figures. We should be very careful not to conflate the costs that are largely agreed to about new capabilities we need in space to defend ourselves. That's where we do have a lot of unanimity there. That's why the budgets are going up, as different from what's the delta cost to have a focused service to do this beyond the cost already sunk into the fairly large organizations that we have today. And I think we should keep those crystal clear and separate. So I appreciate being asked to be here today. I appreciate doing whatever small thing I might be able to do in the future to help. I am excited. Scars are healed. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen here over the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I should note that, again, if you have a question, please go to the website listed on the screens. We have some questions already, but we're happy to entertain your questions. Next speaker is Christina Chaplain. She currently serves as the Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management at the U.S. General Government Accountability Office. She has responsibility for GAO assessments of military space acquisitions, NASA, and the Missile Defense Agency. Prior to her current position, she worked with GAO's financial management and information technology teams. And I wonder, Christina, if you would take a moment to summarize some of the key findings from previous assessments that the GAO has, and possibly the GAO performed, and possibly foreshadow for us a little bit some of the work you have ongoing today in this area.
I think I can do that in the context of a few comments on what I'm seeing today.
Please.
I'll be short. And again, keep in mind I'm looking at things from an acquisition perspective. We don't look as much at the operational picture on my team. But you're hearing a lot of good news today about space, more money being proposed for space, a proposal on the table to reform leadership, and GAO's had a lot of findings about leadership and fragmentation and how they've hampered acquisition over the years. You're getting attention from the highest levels of government. You're seeing DoD being open to very innovative approaches and working more with the commercial sector. And I've spent a long time looking at space and DoD and being pretty frustrated that we couldn't cross that bridge when it came to acquisition. So even with all that good news on the table, I think the next few years are going to be the most challenging for space for a number of reasons. First is that you have a lot of big programs still struggling right now, and we're not out of the woods yet for them. We'll be reporting pretty soon, for example, on the ground control system for GPS, known as OCX. And we still see a lot of schedule risk for that program, and it's already almost 5 years late. And you also recently had another program stop that supports space situational awareness that was pretty critical to helping us protect space systems, known as JMS. So work there has stopped, and we're not quite sure about the way forward. So first, you have programs right now in progress that are having problems. Second, you're seeking to speed up everything, go fast, which there's definitely an urgency to go fast, and we've seen a lot of going slow, mostly because of decision making and that fragmentation. But you have to be careful when you go fast. I know a lot of people here have been in space for a long time, and they can remember when we tried to go fast before, and we had a lot of problems because oversight and insight kind of went out the window when we tried to go fast. So a lot of lessons learned need to be incorporated as we go fast. It's not impossible. It's been done before. So I think just have to be careful. And then third is capacity. We're starting about 10 new programs now, if you really count them. And it could stretch the Air Force, the Space Force, everybody involved with them, not just money-wise. I mean, we have more funding, but you have a very high investment curve for space when programs start out. So hopefully we're considering that in all our funding. And then there's capacity, maybe competition funding-wise too, outside of space. You know, not just within with missile defense layers and all that, but even outside with nuclear triad, Navy ships. There's still going to be competition. And in other types of capacity, workforce, for example, we just reported this month on some issues related to the space acquisition workforce. We have difficulty tracking who's even in the workforce at this point, and yet we're trying to create a space force and move people in there. And then we all know that there's still some gaps in the workforce with technical expertise, and there's a lot of attention to making that grow, but we've talked before about that, like we need to grow people better, train them better, and I never see that really get better. And so in addition to capacity, I think there's also a couple issues. One is implementing the Space Force. As all these 10 new programs are getting underway, there's still going to be a lot of open questions about leadership and who's where. I'm still trying to figure that out myself, and there's some confusion and even potential for some more fragmentation if you're adding a few more organizations into the mix, and there's no real clear lines of where one starts and the other one stops. They have worthwhile goals, and I believe there needs to be somebody very focused on innovation to bring in some of these new programs. But I'm also worried about the way forward, like who's defining the architecture for the way forward, and how are we really going to feed into that? How are we going to enforce that kind of thing? And then the last challenge is just trying to make systems more resilient. We know that needs to be done, but we seem to still have difficulties getting there. We recently reported, maybe last year, on the use of hosted payloads, and it's been surprisingly sparse, and there's still a lot of resistance to going that route. And again, even information being collected on the use of hosted payloads that could encourage people to use them is not being collected in a centralized way. And also when it comes to resiliency, we had a report recently about cyber protection for weapons that says even for all weapons programs, the most basic things need to happen. You know, cyber hygiene, password management. If we don't have that down yet, it's going to be very difficult to get to a place where we can be resilient and really protect the systems that we need to do. But so it's just that these are the challenges that are facing space programs this year. I think they're bigger than ever. Doesn't mean you can't work your way through it, but I think it has to be done with a couple things in mind. That one, the leadership changes in place may not be enough. This is just the beginning of a process that's going to take a long time, and that even just fixing boxes and reporting lines isn't going to solve your problems, and even speeding up things aren't going to solve your problems if you don't really keep those acquisition basics and have the right insight, oversight, and management attention to programs as they go. As far as work coming out from GAO pretty soon, you'll see a report from us in the near future on OCX. We're just getting work underway, looking at the analysis of alternatives for the next wideband capability. We've been looking at some of the new programs on space protection, and I think we'll continue that work. You won't see as many public products on that front. On the missile defense side, we're going to have our missile defense annual report come out probably in a month. And then our NASA side, we have human spaceflight report coming out soon, which should be pretty good. And our annual report on NASA's major projects.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina. Last, we have Todd Harrison, who you know, who's the director of the Aerospace Security Project and Defense Budget Analysis Program here at CSIS, in addition to serving as a senior fellow in the International Security Program. Many hats you wear, Todd. Prior to joining the think tank community, Todd consulted for the Air Force on satellite communication systems. Todd, any wrap-up comments you'd like to make from the day's events or broader comments?
Yeah, I'll keep it short so we can get to Q&A, but I found it interesting that all of our speakers, Dr. Roper, Representative Cooper, Secretary Shanahan, they all focused to some degree on the need to reorient what we're doing in space and the need to modernize our space capabilities. And the driving factor here is we want to be able to continue to support the warfighter the way that we do today. We need to be able to do it in a more highly contested environment. We've got to address some of the gaping vulnerabilities that we have in our space capabilities. Now, there are a lot of different approaches and ways to doing that. I like to think of it, to use a space analogy, we're at a point where we need a major orbit maneuver. We need a plane change operation here. And before you do that, you would never try to maneuver your satellite by firing the thrusters first and then reorienting the satellite. You want to orient the satellite first to make sure you've got the thrusters pointed in the right direction before you start firing, or else you're going to end up someplace you didn't intend to be. You can maneuver, but it might not be the right way. You might maneuver into the threat. And so I think we've got to be cautious here and talking about improving our space capabilities, that first and foremost, we got to make sure that our space organization is properly oriented. There are a lot of different ways to do that, and I know there are competing thoughts, both outside the Pentagon and Congress, but also within the Pentagon, different constructs about how you could reorganize. Throughout this whole debate over the past 2 years, I've noticed that there are three main schools of thought on how to reorganize. One is, let's create a new military service, right? Another is, let's do something kind of like the Missile Defense Agency. Let's break out space acquisitions and let's take it out of the services, put it under OSD, and that way we can nurture it and advance capabilities faster. The third is, what we really need is something like SOCOM. We need a combatant command with service-like authorities. And I think that there are challenges with each of those, quite frankly. And there are merits to each of them. What I'm worried about is we may end up with a Frankenstein approach here that has a little bit of all three. And so I think that is a big risk, going through this legislative session. And it's really up to Congress at this point to sort this all out, because the proposal is over to them. I think what the department can do at this point is help clarify things to Congress of how they intend Space Command, the Space Development Agency, and the Space Force to work with one another, how they are distinguished from one another, and where they have complementary roles rather than conflicting roles. Ultimately, we only heard from Representative Rogers here. Unfortunately, we did invite other members of Congress, but it is a work week. They're back in their home districts for the most part. They weren't able to come, but he gave a very optimistic outlook for the Space Force getting through Congress. I think it is going to be an uphill battle. I think the challenge for Congress is going to be, if they want to get this through successfully, they got to keep it lean. They have to focus on the personnel issue of how are people transferring over. I'll tell you that the Air Force Space Command has said in the past that just Air Force Space Command has 30,000 people. They're talking now that the total Space Force is only going to be about 15,000 people. Why aren't these people transferring over? Are they really all support? And if they're supporting space operations and space acquisitions, why aren't they in the Space Force? Right? And so I think they've got to keep an eye on that and make sure that the services don't start out by saying, oh no, these aren't space people. They don't transfer, because that is a sure recipe to end up having to go back and hire new people to fill those jobs, those functions that need to be done once the Space Force is created. You got to make sure to transfer it over. And in terms of like the senior leadership as well, I fully agree with Chairman Smith that we don't want to be creating a bunch of new 4-star positions. They need to be transferred over. Commander of Air Force Space Command, that 4-star billet, that needs to go away and move into the Space Force. We shouldn't be creating new positions like that wherever we can avoid it. The other big issue that I think hasn't been fully addressed, and Congress is going to have to look in this, is the inclusion of the NRO. a good portion of our nation's space capabilities reside in the NRO. I think most people agree that's a highly functional organization, not without its problems, I'm sure, but you don't want to mess up something that's performing well. Is there a way to include that, if not now, in the future, so that you do get that unity of effort, unity of command for overall national security space? So I think those are some of the challenges that are waiting for Congress, and I think DoD is going to play an important role in helping inform and educate members of Congress so they can make good decisions on all these issues.
That's great. Thank you very much, Todd. We have time for, I think, one question each in a super lightning round here. So keep your answers very almost as short as the questions, if you don't mind. For Kevin, the question from the audience is, if you had to choose between either the Space Development Agency or Space Command, which would you choose and which would be more effective? I would slightly modify the question to say, this is an integrated package. What's the effect of either not going forward with one or more pieces on the overall initiative?
Okay, yeah, I don't know that I could answer the first question just because one's a command of 30,000 people and one's a small organization. But I think the Space Development Agency, what it can do that the current Air Force Command, Space Command and SMC structure probably couldn't do, is because of the bandwidth required for the major programs that the legacy programs that SMC is trying to deliver. Some of them, as we just heard, are having some struggles. While they do have they have people in charge of innovation, I think the Space Development Agency, with a sole focus, can take the time to take a fresh look at not only new architectures, but also spend more bandwidth on new ways of engaging the new companies or the new technology that's out there, and maybe figure out ways to bring that on board, while at the same time trying to understand how the companies that today provide that capability can participate in that as well. It's not an either or. I think those are things that the SDA can actually focus on, like a laser beam, and would be a net add to what we're going to do as a service.
And Christina, for you, in 2015, a GAO review of space acquisition programs noted multiple layers of bureaucracy in the Pentagon that complicated SMC satellite acquisitions. Do the proposals for space acquisition reform being considered, including the Space Development Agency, address any of those concerns?
I'm still trying to figure that out. We have that famous slide of 60 organizations involved with space. And I'm not quite sure what's going away in all this picture. I see some things being added, but I have a lot of questions about what might be going away. I think at the end of the day, you want to see 4 things. You want to see reduced fragmentation. I don't know if that's there. You want to see a priority on space. That seems like it's happening. Protecting funding for space. I don't know the extent how much that will be happening with what's being offered. And then also focus on innovation and a culture change. And we hear a lot of good talk about that. It remains to me to be seen whether that can be done.
All right. Thank you very much. For Mike from Sandra Irwin, please explain what's counted in the $14.1 billion DoD space request. The Air Force says their space budget is $13.8 billion. Why is the Army and Navy not counted in the DoD number?
Good question. So the 14.1 number typically is referred as the MFP, which would include non-Air Force service contributions to the space budget. When a Air Force person is speaking, they may be doing the subset of that MFP that is just the Air Force programs. But generally speaking, the number that has been said over years, like last year was 12.5, this year it's 14.1, that is generally the MFP. What I can't get to when I look at the public justification documents to try and match that dollar to dollar to match that 14.1, I can get up to about 10 billion, and there's about 4 billion that I can't identify in the public justification documents. That has generally, in my research, shown not to be space platforms. We're not talking about missing satellites that I can't find. It's more like the personnel training,
kind of soft money that might be in O&M versus a procurement or RDT&E type of acquisition. So the 14 number depends on who is saying it, but generally speaking, it should be the MFP, which means unclassified, non-MIP, non-special access program, non-military intelligence program, and inclusive of Army, Navy, and all the services. One point I do want to raise in terms of what surprised me in the budget when it came out this year relative to the Space Force proposal is that you'll see that the plan is to defer decision-making on what lines will move into the Space Force from the existing services. But what I've also heard is that they have identified which lines will remain with the existing services. So they haven't identified those which will move over, but they have identified those which are unique service specific and will stay. And that is a surprising approach to me, and I think that the more difficult decision is going to be what's going to move over, and we'll see that in future requests.
Great, thank you. And last for Todd, and then after you answer, if you wouldn't mind wrapping up for us, that would be great. Thank you. Given the importance and need for speed for space capabilities, combined with availability of technology, are the constraints in Title X overly restrictive in your view, and what changes should be made to Title X authorities along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, in acquisitions, there are a lot more authorities than DoD typically uses. And so I think what you really need, rather than continuing to tinker with authorities in the law, I think you need, program managers and you need service acquisition executives who are willing to try things differently and to use all of those authorities. And I am encouraged by folks like Dr. Roper who are willing to kind of push the edge and take these authorities and try to use them to speed acquisitions and to do things in a different way, to change the way we do business. So, in my view, I think we can pause for a bit on Congress getting into this and legislating new authorities, and let's give DoD an opportunity to try to use those authorities more effectively. The key, though, is it's got to be leadership. It's got to come from the top. You've got to have top cover if you want, program managers and contracting officers to actually go along with this. But I see encouraging signs that they are headed in that direction. In the Air Force, take for example the next generation OPIR, for missile warning satellites. They want to go fast on that program, and they are in part because they're using these new Section 804 authorities in the law. And yeah, they may be pushing the limits of what was intended by that, but good for them. Let's do it. Let's go fast. If that's the way you got to do it, let's use those authorities and carry them through. The key is you got to be transparent when you're doing this with Congress, because inevitably there will be problems and things will get messed up. And if you aren't transparent with Congress, what they're going to do is they're going to come back and take away that authority. So I think that's a key responsibility for these folks that want to go fast and use full authorities that are already in the law.
Right, in on the takeoff.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. And so I gather we're out of time now. And so, on behalf of CSIS and the whole team in SSA and everyone who helped put this together, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank all of our speakers today and all of the panelists as well for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. Nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, you too.